Michelangelo, the Italian sculptor, he was also an architect and a painter and a poet, is most remembered for his painting in the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel at the Vatican. But there was another painting that he worked on around that same time that was also going to be placed in the Sistine Chapel. It was also contracted by the Pope, and it was a painting that was entitled The Last Judgment. Well, while this great artist was working on this great work, the Pope's administrator continuously pestered him for a glimpse of the painting before the artist was ready to unveil it. And so this administrator bothered him, got under his skin. And so when the work was finally unveiled, right there in the middle of those people who were damned in hell, being tormented by Satan and his demons, was clearly the face of this Pope's administrator. There was a Philadelphia woman who, in her will, instructed her executor to invest $1 and then take the interest every year off of that dollar and send it to her ex-husband as evidence of her estimate of his worth. And there was another woman also from Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, who bequeathed her divorced husband $1 to go buy a rope and hang himself. Some years ago, there was a murderer who was sentenced to life in prison with no option of parole. Well, the convicted man's brother was a wonderful man. He had done great things for the state and for the governor, and he asked the governor if he would grant his brother a pardon, and the pardon was granted. And so the man visited his brother with a pardon in his pocket. But he asked him, "What would you do if you received a pardon?" And his brother, who was sentenced to a life in prison, said, "The first thing I would do is track down the judge who sentenced me, and I would murder him. And the second thing I would do is to track down the chief witness and murder him." The brother, of course, was very disappointed, very surprised, and he left the prison with his brother's pardon still in his pocket. And then this story I really liked. A college professor was sleeping soundly one morning when the phone startled him at 3 a.m. "This is Mr. Smith, your neighbor. Your dog is barking and keeping me awake." The professor thanked him kindly and apologized and hung up. The next morning, Mr. Smith's phone rang at exactly 3 a.m. "This is your neighbor, the professor. I just wanted you to know that I don't have a dog." Now, what was the motivation in each of these stories? Was it not retaliation or revenge, that desire to get even? That painter who had been bothered, he got even. Those Philadelphia women who fixed up their husbands in their wills, they wanted one last got you, one last display of retaliation. They wanted to get even with their ex-husbands. The murderer showed that he did not deserve to get out of prison because he was eaten up with this desire to get those responsible for putting him there. And this college professor, who could have told his caller at the time that he had no dog, chose a very nice way of getting even. Called and woke him up in the middle of his sleep the next night. Retaliation, revenge. Now you just think with me for a moment about how much of our lives is consumed by a desire to get even with someone who has offended us. Now, if we are quick-witted and we're resourceful, we have probably gotten even plenty. And even if we are not quick-witted and resourceful, we've probably laid awake at night thinking about what we should have said and what we should have done to get even. We like to get even. We like to watch television shows and read books and go to movies where the hero gets even. And no matter how well written it is, no matter how interesting the plot is, or how good the screenplay is, or how excellent the actors are, if the hero does not get revenge by the end, then we are disappointed. You see, there's something about retaliation. There's something about revenge that brings satisfaction. It makes us feel good. Sometimes a nation demands revenge. The Doolittle raid on Japan was in retaliation for the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. And when the Doolittle Raiders dropped those bombs on Japan, it gave the American people some sense of satisfaction that had been some revenge or retaliation. But you see, deep down, retaliation, revenge is something that is built into our sinful nature. We have in us a spirit of retaliation. It comes with our sinful nature. It might be, in fact, it probably is the nastiest spirit that controls us. You see, we can get a handle on other things that might control us from time to time: the desire for money, ambition, preoccupation with less than honorable interest. But getting a handle on and quenching this spirit of retaliation, well, it's darn near impossible. And in fact, it is absolutely impossible to conquer the spirit of retaliation in our own power. Well, Jesus gives instructions in the passages that we're going to study tonight from the Sermon on the Mount about how we can move from the natural thing, that is, wanting to get revenge, to the supernatural, and to conquer this nasty spirit within us that always wants to get even. It's possible. It's possible to attain, but I assure you, the remedy that Jesus prescribes, we are not going to like. We can call this one of the hard teachings of Jesus. And so the section we're going to deal with tonight can be called the law of retaliation. Matthew chapter 5, verse 38, that's where we began. Jesus said, "You have heard the law that says the punishment must match the injury. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." Now, Jesus, once again, is using that same formula that he's always been using. He begins by stating the law, and then he gives his interpretation of it, the fulfilling of it, giving God's original intent. And the law in question here is simply eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Jesus summarized the law. Listen, here's what Moses actually said. This is from Leviticus and Exodus. "But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise." That's pretty inclusive, isn't it? And then from Leviticus, "If anyone injures his neighbor, whatever he has done must be done to him. Fracture for fracture, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. As he has injured the other, so he is to be injured." And so this law, the Old Testament law, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, it sounds pretty nasty. I can even picture eyes being gouged out and someone holding another person down and pulling a tooth with a pair of vice grips and no Novocaine. And so is there anything good in this law? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth? What could have been Moses? What could have been God's intent in giving this nasty sounding law? Well, the law, although it sounded kind of nasty, it was actually a means of grace when we think about the ways that justice was administered without it. You see, in Moses' day, the pattern of justice was based on revenge alone. Whatever one felt they had to do to get even, that was okay. Ernest Holloway, a Baptist writer, explains the problem with revenge-motivated justice. He says, Mr. A killed Mr. B. Then Mr. B's family kills someone in Mr. A's family. Mr. A's family retaliated by killing someone in Mr. B's family. And then he gives another scenario. Mr. A broke Mr. B's finger. Then Mr. B then broke Mr. A's arm. Mr. A responded by breaking Mr. B's leg. And so each act of revenge escalated the violence rather than ending it. So in that context of the way that justice was being meted out, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, it accomplished two very important things. The first is the amount of revenge was now specified in the law. Revenge now had a limit. If someone broke your arm, you could not legally kill him. You could only break his arm. And what this did, of course, was stop the escalating cycle of revenge. You did it to me. I did the same thing to you. Now we're even. The other important thing this law did was to put matters like this in a court of law. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth was never meant for a way for individuals to handle their problems. It was a law that was to be interpreted and applied through the government, through a justice system. So from what Edelman, in his little commentary, calls those dark days of hot-headed and uninhibited revenge in inflicting injury far beyond what they had received, the law of eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth made great progress. There was still room for revenge, but now it was limited by the law. Moses gave the law to put limits, to put restraints on this nasty spirit of revenge that sometimes controls us. If you must get revenge, this is far as you can go. Well, there it is, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. So knowing what we know about the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, it's easy to imagine what they did with this law, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. You see, they failed to see God's grace in it. They did not see eye for eye, tooth for tooth as an option, as an extreme. They didn't see it as a limit as to what God allowed. They saw it as a mandatory law, their God-given right if they were wronged. So they reacted out of this spirit of retaliation and revenge, and then they would point to God's word and say they were obeying the law. It was their authority. It gave them the encouragement for what they had done. And although this law was meant for the courts, the Pharisees used it to exact personal vengeance. Moses gave the law for restraint. The Pharisees used the law as license for personal revenge. Edelman summarizes the law this way. It has been stated lightly, if tritely, in these words: tit for tat, butter for fat, you kill my dog, I'll kill your cat. And then he adds, after 20 centuries, we haven't progressed much further. And then Jesus, it's his turn. Verse 39, but I say, do not resist an evil person. Now, after stating the law, basically, it's okay to fairly get even with an evil person. Jesus said, but I tell you, and then he says something very strange. Do not resist an evil person. Now, the word in the original language translated resist means to set oneself against. So just because some evil person wrongs you doesn't mean you automatically put yourself on the defensive. Don't automatically consider that person your enemy. The Good News Bible has, do not take revenge on someone who wrongs you. That's probably the meaning. Don't return evil with more evil. Clarence Jordan in his Cotton Patch version has, but I'm telling you, never respond with evil. So we are not to resist an evil person, but are we supposed to resist evil? Of course we are. We are called on to oppose sin and evil wherever we find it. We are commanded to oppose any person who is abusive toward others, but we don't resist. We don't oppose them out of a spirit of retaliation. And then Jesus follows that statement by giving us 4 scenarios that would automatically result in a person wanting to get even. In fact, in Jesus' day, these are 4 situations that would immediately have triggered a spirit of retaliation in just a fraction of a second. And in each case, the natural response to the situation is retaliation. Jesus is going to state the situation, and then he's going to give a seemingly impossible reaction to each, a reaction that does not include a motivation of retaliation. In these 4 scenarios, Jesus is going to teach that whatever the wrong, we should absorb it ourselves, the insult, the hurt, without striking back, even making ourselves vulnerable to more hurts and more insults if our striking back, this is important, if our striking back comes out of this spirit of revenge. And so here's the first one, verse 39. If someone slaps you on the right cheek, offer the other cheek also. someone strikes you on the right cheek. Now, I have to say this, back then, back in New Testament days, cheeks were limited to facial features, dancing cheek to cheek. So what is our natural response if someone comes up to us and slaps us? It is to retaliate in some way, isn't it? Either with words, fists, or tire irons. Now, it's significant that Jesus spoke of which cheek that was slapped, the right cheek. Jesus lived in a right-handed world. And because of that, what he's talking about is a backhanded slap. Not considered so much violence as it was an insult. It was a display of contempt. William Barclay says that according to Jewish rabbinic law, to hit a man with the back of the hand was twice as insulting to hit him with the flat of the hand. It's tough not to retaliate when someone hits you and then insults you, isn't it? But Jesus gives what seems to us to be the impossible response. Turn to him the other cheek also. Barclay says that what Jesus' teaching means here is that even if a man should direct at you the most deadly and calculated insult, you must on no account retaliate, and you must on no account resent it. Now, not retaliating it, that's one thing, but not resenting it, not laying in bed at night thinking of ways to get even, not stewing over the matter, that's even a tougher command, isn't it? Baseball player and prize fighter Billy Sunday, who was also a preacher, was tested on this. Someone hauled off and hit him. He turned the other cheek, and the man hit him on the other cheek. And then Billy Sunday beat the man to a pulp. He had followed the letter of the law, hadn't he? But Jesus mentions a second thing. If you are sued in court, this is verse 40, if you are sued in court and your shirt is taken from you, give your coat too. Now, what's our natural reaction when someone files a legal suit against us? Isn't it to find the most expensive attorney we can afford, who will drag their rear ends to court and show them a thing or two? To Jesus' audience, this wasn't just giving someone a pair of socks or a shirt to avoid court. There were two garments worn by males in Jesus' day. The shirt, which was like long john underwear. A Jewish man might own several changes of these, hopefully. But the coat, the cloak, that was a very special garment. It was very expensive, and usually Jewish males only owned one. It kept him warm during the day, and he spread it over his family at night. It was such an important article of clothing that Jewish laws actually protected it. If a banker, for example, took the coat as collateral, he had to give it back to the man. The banker had to give it back to the man each night. This very important, essential garment, considered a necessity, this cloak, this coat. Jesus said, if it's going to avoid conflict with that someone who wants to sue the shirt or the underwear off of you, then give him your underwear and give him your coat. Go cold and naked, if that's what is required to avoid conflict. It's really a question of rights, isn't it? Jesus is saying that as Christians, we should be willing to forego our rights under certain circumstances. There were people then, there are people now who would not even hear of foregoing one of their rights. Barclay says there are people who are forever standing on their rights, who clutch their privileges to them and who will not be pried loose from them, who will militantly go to law rather than suffer what they regard as the slightest infringement of them. The Christian thinks not of his rights, but of his duties, not of his privileges, but his responsibilities. The man who will fight to the legal death for his rights inside or outside the church is far from the Christian way. Well, here's the third thing Jesus mentions. Verse 41. If a soldier demands that you carry his gear for a mile, carry it 2 miles. Now you remember that at this time that Palestine was under Roman rule, and a Roman soldier could rightfully compel a Jewish person to carry his pack for 1 mile. Now there was already a hatred between the Jews and the Romans. The soldiers were self-contained units, and the pack that they carried was heavy. And so we can well imagine the burning resentment with which a Jew stooped and shouldered that pack. The whole mile was probably spent grumbling and cursing, and when it was completed, the Jewish man would throw the pack down on the ground, and then more cursing, and then the Jew, in contempt, would spit along the ground, aiming at the burden he just carried. And this, of course, would elicit a laugh from the Roman soldiers, for they delighted in this compulsory servitude, which was their right. So we're in that situation. We carry the burden a mile. What is our natural reaction? It's just like the Jews had, retaliation. But Jesus said, do something impossible. Volunteer to carry it another mile. Bob Mumford, in his commentary, The King in You, says this: can you picture the surprise of one of the Roman soldiers if at the end of the 1 mile the Jew came up with, do you mind if I carry it another mile? I haven't obtained victory over this yet. Edelman says the extra you do guarantees that what is required has already been given. Law is in the first mile, but love is in the second mile. And then the last scenario, verse 42. Give to those who ask, and don't turn away from those who want to borrow. Now, Jesus is describing a situation, it's one that we've experienced, where a person is always asking us for something or asking us to borrow something, and they do it so often it's at the point of being on our nerves. And it might be because this person just does it continuously. It might be because that person never repays what they ask for, or they maybe never return it, what they borrow, or it may be because whatever they borrow, they return in not so good a shape. Here's a question. Have you let people borrow things maybe years ago and they've not returned them? Or they returned them broken? And here's a rougher question. What about you? Have you borrowed something that you have not returned? When that person asks to borrow an item again or asks for money, what is our natural response? It's one of retaliation. Can I borrow your lawnmower? Can I borrow your vacuum cleaner? They've done it before. They either haven't returned it or returned it broken. And our response is one of revenge. Not just no, but heck no. And Jesus said to give to the one who continually borrows or asks. Malcolm Tolbert says the spirit of revenge is forbidden to the disciple. Its opposite, the spirit of open-handed generosity, is to determine his retaliation to others. So is Jesus teaching here indiscriminate giving? Are we to always give? Are we to always allow people to borrow from us? Well, the specific teaching here is that one shouldn't not give or allow to borrow out of a spirit of retaliation. The disciple shouldn't refuse to give it if he's motivated by revenge. Tolbert says, if we do not give what is asked of us, it should not be because of a lack of generosity on our part. You see, there are legitimate reasons not to give someone or to allow someone to borrow from us. Jesus did not say, give to him that asks you everything he asked for. Being good stewards, we are required to take care of our things. God expects us to relate properly to our things and care for our things. That's part of good stewardship. So if you know someone is irresponsible and won't take care of that item, and it's an item that you need, don't lend it to them. If you believe their use of the item will be dangerous to them, will cause them bodily harm, then don't loan it to them. One writer says, kind actions that encourage the other person to persist in irresponsible behavior, those actions are not truly kind. Barclay says it's clear that the effect of giving on the receiver must be taken into account. Giving must never be such as to encourage him in laziness or in shiftlessness, for such giving can only hurt. We must be generous, but we must also be good stewards. Our world has great needs. We have limited resources. If that person wants to borrow from us, or that person asks us for something, our response can be no, as long as the motivation is not revenge or retaliation. So here are 4 retaliation-provoking situations. Someone slaps you, someone backhands you. You are sued for your underwear. compelled to carry a burden a mile. One nagging borrower has hit you up for yet another charitable contribution. In each instance, Jesus says not to do the natural. That is, don't act out of a motivation of retaliation, but instead do something impossible, something supernatural, and do it from a motivation of love. Now, Jesus, of course, here, the surface teaching here is that he is teaching us how we should behave, about not doing things because of revenge. But what's more important than that is he is giving us, and this is the hard teaching, the 4-step cure for a nasty spirit of retaliation. You see, all of the verbs that Jesus uses are in that Greek tense that in order to bring them into English, we would have to put the words keep on in front of them and the letters ing behind them. We are to keep on turning the other cheek. We are to keep on giving our coat. We are to keep on walking another mile. We are to keep on lending, keep on giving. You see, he is giving us the formula to break the grip of a spirit of retaliation. We keep on until the spirit of retaliation is broken within us. And when we no longer have that spirit of revenge, then we can punch that guy in the nose because he needs it. He deserves it. We can get a high-powered lawyer and go to court. We can tell that soldier that we did not appreciate being compelled to carry his burden just because he was lazy. And we can tell that person, I'm sorry, you're not responsible. I'm not loaning you my lawnmower out of a motivation other than retaliation. Jesus is not prohibiting us from doing any of those things, but he is forbidding any of those if they are motivated by a desire to get even. He wants us to act out of a spirit of love, not revenge. Many years ago, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev visited a cathedral, and he made this statement. He said, "There is much in Christ that is in common with us communists, but I cannot agree with him when he says that when you are hit on the right cheek, turn the left cheek. I believe in another principle. If I am hit on the left cheek, I will hit you back on the right cheek so hard your head will fall off. This is my sole difference with Christ." Of course, he had many differences with Christ, but Khrushchev plainly stated that he operated out of a spirit of retaliation. Christians, we need to do what we need to do to be responsible people and to protect our families and our property. And some of those things might not seem very kind in nature, but the important thing, according to Jesus, is our motivation for doing them. If we do anything to get even, if we do anything because that spirit of retaliation has swelled up in us, then we are wrong. And Jesus has given us this painful and hard cure for the spirit of retaliation. I used to have a little statue in my office of this ugly little man, and underneath it said this: "I don't get mad, I get even." Listen, I don't have that anymore. But I've determined this: the only time when it's okay, the only time where it's legitimate to get even is when someone plays a practical joke on you. Other than that, it's not in line with the Christian life. What a great teaching, what a hard teaching Jesus has given us. Oh, but what a difference it would make in our life. Not stewing, not spending half our life thinking about ways to get even with someone who has hurt us or offended us in some way.